But Kim used to say to my mum, even at the bitter end, history will judge me kindly. He really believed, or at least he definitely was convinced he believed that they'd done the right thing. And I think in many ways he probably did, but I do think there also must have been nights where he struggled to sleep.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. In June 1934, Kim Philby met his Soviet handler, the spy Arnold Deutsch. Philby was a British intelligence officer and a double agent for the Soviet Union. In 1963, he was revealed to be a member of the Cambridge 5 spy ring, which had divulged British secrets to the Soviets during World War II and the early stages of the Cold War. The woman who introduced Philby to Deutsch was Edith Tudor-Hart, and her story has never been told. Edith Tudor-Hart changed the course of 20th century history, and then she was written out of it. I speak with Charlotte Philby, granddaughter of Kim Philby. Charlotte has written Edith and Kim, which draws on the secret intelligence files on Edith Tudor-Hart, along with the private archive letters of Kim Philby. This finely worked, evocative and beautifully tense novel tells for the first time the story of the woman behind the third man. We also hear from Charlotte what it was like having Kim Philby as her grandfather, including details of her visits to see him in Moscow during the Cold War. It's a fascinating insight into one of the most notorious spies of the Cold War. Now, this podcast relies on your support to enable me to continue to capture these incredible stories and make them available to you. If you'd like to continue to hear the podcast and help preserve Cold War history, you can support me via one-off or monthly donations. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate for more details. If a financial contribution is not your cup of tea, then you can still help us by leaving written reviews wherever you listen to us, as well as sharing us on social media. It really helps us get new guests on the show. So, back to today's episode. I'm delighted to welcome Charlotte Philby to our Cold War conversation. One of the things I love to do on the podcast is the unknown stories of the Cold War, stories that perhaps have been brushed over in other accounts or just unheard voices. And I think Edith Tudor-Hart certainly fits that bill.
I think she does. I mean, for me, Kim's story is infinitely interesting, as it is to many people, but not just the story itself, but the fact of the different ways in which it's been told and what it means to different people. And it was really exciting for me to find a character in there who I knew so little about and who it would seem had this extremely pivotal role in Kim's life and he and hers. And for her to almost sort of be written out of history, although I should add that her nephew, Peter F. Young, made a fantastic documentary about her life tracking Edith and was very helpful to me in introducing me to the right people. She is just the most fascinating character, regardless of her connection to my grandfather. She was not just a spy. She was a phenomenal photographer who's now recognized for the talent that she was. She was a single mother, fully committed to a child who today probably would have been diagnosed as schizophrenic. She was a revolutionary. She was a spy. She was many things wholeheartedly at once. And that is, for me, why she's such an extraordinary figure. And then there's this connection to my grandfather, which just makes it sort of mind-blowing.
I'd come across her name, and because she's not, I don't know, the books that I'd read, probably she's more of a footnote rather than a pivotal figure. I'd imagine that she was, with a hyphenated name, she was some English woman who had, become involved in left-wing politics. But I found, the fact that she was Austrian and brought up in Austria and her early life absolutely fascinating. Can we just go back and and you tell us about, where she was born and her early life.
Yes, so she was born in the first decade of the 1900s, and she was the daughter of a bookseller, the first socialist bookseller in this sort of working class district of Vienna. That her parents had sort of chosen to live in because they weren't actually working class, but I think they sort of felt connected to that place and to the people who lived there. And she and her father, she sort of, to me, she inherited aspects of her father, who was incredibly sort of forward-thinking and progressive, but that their views differed. I think she didn't feel that his views went far enough. But she sort of grew up against the backdrop of the sort of interwar period in Vienna. She was very much there when everything was happening, in a way that I feel, it's not that I feel that Kim and the sort of the Cambridge Spies were like voyeurs, or that they sort of adopted the cause in a cynical way, but they chose to be involved. For Edith, this was sort of innate. It was part of her sort of formative experience. And she in herself was fascinating. She went and studied under Maria Montessori when she was just 16 years old. She then went on to the Bauhaus and trained as a photographer. And she met Kim in Vienna in 1933. Kim had gone there, sort of gone to Maurice Dobb, who was his economic professor at Cambridge, and said, what can I do to help? Where can I go? I've got £100 that was given to him by his father, St. John. And he said, I'm going to go off on my motorbike. Where shall I go? And Maurice Dobb put him in touch with someone in Paris who suggested that he went to Vienna. And there he lodged at the house of a young woman called Litzy Friedman, who I'm sure your listeners will be familiar with. Kim became a lodger at their house. By that point, Litzy had already been imprisoned for her activity, and Kim went to live with her, and through Litzy met her best friend Edith, who was slightly older. And she ended up marrying a medical student called Alexander Tudor-Hart at the same time as Litzy and Kim married, and they both went to London together. A month after they went to London, it was Edith who introduced Kim to Arnold Deutsch on the park bench in Regent's Park. And at that moment, there's a question of, their lives sort of diverged, and I don't want to give too much of the plot away, although obviously much of it is history and much of it you'll know. It's also a novel, and it's very much my own reconstruction of the events as I found them, both through my readings about Kim and Edith, about through the family letters that I inherited, that I've sort of been reading and rereading for the past decade or so, and through the secret intelligence service files that were held on Edith from 1930 to her death.
And I think the way that you tell this story is great. I love the format where you've got the mixture of the SIS files in there, and you've got these imagined letters between Kim and Edith that are obviously based on the letters that you have in your possession, and they're in his style. For me, it sort of gave me more of an insight into his character, because I think when people are writing personal letters, you get to know much more. Well, yeah, I think you get much more of a feeling of them, and I can imagine and sort of see how you're reflecting his character in those letters. But the opening of the book I loved, because it's maybe we shouldn't betray the opening of the book, but the opening of the book I really love the scene setting there. And I was interested, when I was researching the interview, because I don't just throw these together, Charlotte, there's a little bit of research going on, but apparently you found quite a strong bond with her, because there were some locations that were part of your formative years which had a link with Edith as well.
Yes, well, quite a few in a fashion that kind of made me feel quite chilled. So I went to school. It wasn't where I lived. It was nearby, but it was a school in St John's Wood where my mum was a teacher. And Edith lived in the flats just next to the park where I used to go and play after school. And it was also where Kim, coincidentally, had grown up. Again, sort of not, I don't believe that's a connection that they would have ever have made. And then I've lots of family in Vienna on the other side of my family, my maternal family. But what was particularly striking to me is that she ended up running an antique shop on Bond Street in Brighton. And when I went back and found the actual shop front, it was next door to the smoking shop where I used to buy my smoking papers. And it's become a bar where I used to drink when I was a student there. And it was just extraordinary to imagine that she lived this life and she was this amazing character who had so much significance in my grandfather's life that I'd never known about. And also who I felt I had this connection to by virtue of the fact that we'd sort of walked the same streets. And what was particularly sort of emotional, I guess, when I was researching the book, a lot of it I wrote. I mean, I feel like I've been writing it in my head and sort of preparing for it for more than a decade. But the process of actually putting pen to paper and doing a lot of the research in terms of going and seeing the locations happened in lockdown, ironically, because, we weren't actually able to travel. But the London walking that I was able to do for those sections of the book, it was really eerie because there was no one else around. And I was able to sort of walk from the Isocon building, which is near my mum's house, and again, near where I grew up, and Hampstead Heath, where I spent my childhood, most of the weekends, sort of throwing sticks for our dog. And, these are the same paths where she was meeting Arnold Deutsch and handing over information. And from there to Belsize Park and to parts of London. My favourite moment was outside Sutherland Avenue, one of her flats in Maida Vale. And I kid you not, there's a phone box, and then in front of the front door there was a red napkin dropped. Like it was something out of a spy novel. It was amazing. But there sort of so much of her life was around that part of North London. But I love her connection to the Isocon building, which is very near, like as I said, near where I grew up. And that was, I felt like that was one of my favourite characters in the book. It's such an extraordinary place. And I sort of knew its reputation slightly, but it sort of represented different aspects of Edith's life in the sense that it was this sort of very bohemian sort of like hotbed of wife swapping and spies, and the actual physical construction of the building meant that it was very difficult to see in from outside, and once you were inside it was very easy to disappear, and there were sort of external exits to the rear to Belsize Woods, which sort of meant that people could escape very easily. But it also encapsulated this amazing design sensibility and the whole sort of modernist movement of which Edith was part. And Edith took the photos of the exterior and the interior for the original press shots. And, key players there were like Marcel Breuer, lots of the Bauhaus alumni that she wouldn't actually necessarily have crossed over with when she was at the Bauhaus, but they were slightly before her time. But she would have met them there. And there are cameos from Agatha Christie, who was a one-time resident. So that was one of my favorite spots.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that building because it is a fascinating building, very striking. There were other sort of espionage links within that building as well. Arnold Deutsch had a flat there, but also Jürgen Kuczynski, who was the brother of Agent Sonia, who Ben McIntyre has recently written about. So there was a multi espionage connection to this place.
Yeah, so Lawn Road Flats, or the Icecon building, has a very rich history for spies, creatives. There's a brilliant book called The Lawn Road Flats - Spies, Writers and Artists by David Burke, which gives a really comprehensive history. There's also the memoir by Jack Pritchard, who sort of created it with Wells Coates. and that is called View from a Long Chair, which I love, which sort of talks to the furniture that he created with Marcel Breuer. And there's wonderful pictures of, the place at that time when it was built, and it's just extraordinary. And it already had the sort of the spy connection before Arnold Deutsch moved in, and it was Edith who actually encouraged him to go and live there when he was living in London, sponsored by his cousin Oscar, who I believe owned the Odeon cinema chain.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So her involvement in left-wing politics comes from a family influence there, and you sort of touched on it earlier that during this period there was a rise of fascism. You had Mussolini had been in power since the 1920s. Hitler came to power in 1933, and obviously the Nazis had been around earlier than that. And also the Spanish Civil War as well. So there was a feeling of people that there had to be something better than this, which drew a lot of people into left-wing politics. And obviously Kim was one of those that became involved and wanted to do more, which is why he ended up in Vienna. And Litzy, his wife, plays quite a role in the book as well, doesn't she?
She does. She's a fascinating character. I would have loved to have met her. I felt she had been written about before more than Edith. So I sort of, it's not that I intentionally sidelined her, but she definitely plays a role that I wanted Edith to take sort of central stage. But I feel like, there's definitely a sense that she might have helped galvanize Kim. So, or at least, she took charge. When you read about her stories, it's usually, there's a sort of, it seems to me a bit of a fixation with the fact that he was supposedly a virgin when he arrived in Austria, and she sort of broke him. And, I find it interesting that that is what's been sort of often seems to be mentioned. They were very liberated women, and I love it. They had a real, there was Wilhelm Reich at that time. They were reading a lot about contraception and about these sort of, they were taking on, it wasn't just against the rise of fascism. It was like, it was about creating a world that was the world that they wanted to live in. And I feel that they were so brave, and they were so undistracted from their goals. And yet what's fascinating about Edith is, for me, but one of the reasons she's fascinating is because Kim sort of insisted that he was two people. He was a private person, and he was a political person. And if forced to choose, he said, of course I would choose the political, but I feel Edith and Litzy, neither of them to me felt like they saw that as their choice. And perhaps there was something to do with the fact that they were women. And Natalie, in Litzy's case, because she became a mother later. But for Edith, she was a mother, she was a spy, she was all of these aspects of her life sort of fully and at once. And she didn't have the luxury of making that choice like Kim did. She didn't have a wife at home looking after the children. If she had made that choice to put her commitment to the cause ahead of her child, that would have been absolutely abhorrent. But, for Kim, that's not something we mention. We never say, oh, he betrayed his family. It's always he betrayed his men, he betrayed his country. And I think that was one of the things that I was particularly fascinated in sort of exploring in the book.
It is a fascinating study in the inequalities that there were at that time, but also how both Litzy and Edith sort of just rebelled against that and wanted to live a better, more independent life than, their mothers had ever lived or would ever have dreamed of. I did interview a couple of years ago somebody who spoke to Litzy when she was in East Germany. And I asked, I think it was a him, and for the life of me, I can't remember who it was. It's because there's so many episodes now.
Yes.
But I said, did you ask her about Kim? And he said, I did. And all she would say was that Kim was always a gentleman.
Oh. they must have felt incredible loyalty and sort of connection to one another, sort of, clinging to those memories amidst, because you get, to get to a stage in one's life when you have, in Kim's case, sort of working both sides, the number of people that you have betrayed, the number of secrets you're keeping, it must start to really mess with your head, no matter how, he was clearly brilliant at deceiving people and maintaining his front, regardless of who he's talking to, regardless of how much alcohol been drunk, regardless of anything. But there must have been a sense that real paranoia and can't trust anyone. And I think that was kind of why I sort of imagined Edith, I suppose, sort of as his conscience. And what was amazing to me was, there's no evidence of them having kept in touch after that moment on the park bench. But when I went back to Moscow in 2010 and found by very sleuthish methods the apartment that he lived and died in Moscow 22 years after I'd last been there. When we finally found the flat, and Rufa very kindly let us in, and, well, not let us in, sort of welcomed us with open arms, my partner and I, and laid on this sort of lavish tea. I went into Kim's study, and Barney took a couple of photos because I was doing a piece for The Independent, sort of like following me, tracing Kim's footsteps for the first time as an adult. And recently I looked back at a couple of the photos that had been taken in his study because I was looking for the titles of specific books. I sort of zoomed into the spines. And in the top left-hand corner, so sort of unobvious that you wouldn't have noticed it unless you had been zooming in as I was the photo that Edith had taken of Kim as a young man, which was the only tangible link between them and actually the image that became her unraveling. And it felt almost like a message to the outside world. And so the positioning of it sort of almost sounds ridiculous, but it felt like a sort of angel on his shoulder. And I imagined him looking at that picture and sort of remembering and using that as a reminder of why they'd done what they did. And there's a huge chance that I'm reading too much into it, but I don't think I am. And the fact that it was there all that time, and the journalists that, when he finally spoke to the press, were coming and going, Philip Knightley, Genrikh Borovic, they were coming to his flat, sitting in that room. They never got him to say who the person was who introduced him on that bench, and he always refers to it in the books as he. And all the time, Edith's portrait was sitting there staring at the light.
Was up there all the time.
I think he found that very funny.
Wow. Yeah. It's almost like deliberate, just winding him up.
Yeah. It's to his sort of humour, I would think.
So did Rufina not know that you were turning up? You just showed up?
No, she didn't know. And I know this seems completely ridiculous, but when I said, because we used to go there a lot in the 80s. So I was born in 83 and he died in 88. So I was very young, but we used to go there every year. My dad went, used to go several times a year. So we knew the place very well. But when I asked my mum and my aunts for an address, they said, well, we were never given an address. They had a P.O. box, that they would send it to in the central post office on Tversky Riyadh. But no one was ever given an address because we would be met at the airport by these men in suits and thrown into the back of a car with a sort of flashing light on top and whisked down the motorway to Moscow. So it was almost farcical. We had a napkin. We were sitting around at Sunday lunch, a napkin and sort of various half-cut relatives with a pencil trying to remember sort of in relation to, I think, McDonald's. There was a McDonald's, which was the sort of extraordinary landmark which we sort of worked from. And they sort of drew out what they thought would be the route. And Barney and I sort of followed this very unreliable map and found the outside, a sort of gated entrance, which I recognised. And we literally waited for somebody to go in and slipped in behind them and then just went and rang all the doorbells. And eventually heard this, in Russian.
Yeah.
And I said, Charlotte Philby. And Rufina, Charlotte? She was completely shocked. And eventually, she came down and saw us and she burst into tears. It was very moving. And she died last year in May, which is very sad. But it makes sort of my memories of that place even more poignant for me now, because I'll never go back, and obviously in life, everything that's happening now will never go back. But yeah.
That's incredible sleuthing there. And also remembering the look of the place from being so young to be able to identify the gates.
It was, it was quite incongruous. It has a sort of particular look to it. And I remember the positioning. There was a school next to it, and it sort of sits on this corner. It's just quite a specific looking building. And inside it had been kept like a mausoleum. It was exactly the same. And it's not just that my memories are fooling me. Like, we have family photos of me sitting with my grandfather and Rufa and her family, and my dad and everyone, and with the same table in front of us, the same muskets on the wall, the same furs. And actually there was a little framed photo on the corner of me when I was about 4, which was quite, again, quite moving. And then his study had been kept as is. It was fascinating seeing all the books, sort of Jeeves and Worcester and Anthony Trollope side by side with Communist Manifesto. The dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yeah. I mean, what was it like going into that study? Because, I mean, that must have been really, almost in the presence of him, I guess, is almost what it felt like.
It felt intrusive, to be honest, at first. But then I had to remind myself that he'd been dead 22 years and probably quite a few people had passed it. He was quite proprietary about certain things. We used to have this game, but if anyone sat in his chair, he had this big brown armchair, and if anyone sat in it, he'd hit the roof. So when he went out the room, I used to sit in it, and then he'd go out, and then just as he was coming back in, I'd sort of run out and he'd say, "Who's been sitting in my chair?" So I did have this sense of like, who's been in my study? But it felt like, almost felt like he was there, really. His typewriter had been replaced by a Dell laptop, which I think he would have approved of, especially when you read the book and you see his constant moaning about his ongoing fight with the typewriter.
Yeah. Yeah. And did Rufina talk about him?
No. I mean, I have to be honest. Her English had diminished significantly, and I don't speak Russian. So the communication was mainly sort of, the sort of international language of hugs and, body language. But she obviously, she loved him. The fact that she was so elated to see us. And that was because I was a connection to him, and she wanted to talk about the memories. And my dad had died a year earlier, which was has sort of been the trigger for me, sort of really becoming, I don't want to say obsessed, but, very fascinated with his father and the sort of the legacy and the impact that had on him. And Rufa was obviously very fond of my dad, who first went and found Kim when he was 19, just after he'd absconded, and visited, regularly thereafter. And I think probably he reminded her of him, though my dad was led a very different life. But she just obviously loved Kim, and I know there's this, and I know she was sort of put there by the KGB, but she did also say to my mum said, Putin, when he got in, maybe this is a force for good for Russia. Obviously this was a long, long, long time ago. And she said, oh no, same, more KGB, same, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Because also on that visit, I've seen photos of you visiting his grave as well.
That was, again, farcical, because I arrived, and there are two, at Kontsevo Cemetery, there are two cemeteries, and there's the one for the sort of, the layman, and we rocked up there, and it's bloody miles from the other one. And it was minus 26 degrees, and we were dressed in these ridiculous outfits, which were, just every warm thing that my family friends had lent us because we were in our 20s. We didn't really, we were a bit gung-ho when we were packing, and my mum's friend sort of came over and said, "Look, you need these walking boots, you need these furs, so we sort of looked rather strange and we rocked up at the cemetery and got out and just sort of set about thinking that we would just find his grave, which is completely ludicrous, even in an English, that had sort of English script on the gravestone cemetery. Anyway, eventually we managed to embroil the security guard in some form of conversation and kept saying the name Philby, Kim Philby over and over again. And then finally somebody else in the room stood up and said, "Philby." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Get in." And suddenly we're in the back of this blacked out 4x4 driving out of the cemetery, a man in a long black coat driving us out of the cemetery, up the road, sort of forest on either side. I'm like, oh my good God, this is where it ends. A few minutes later, we were taken into the correct, the sort of one that's, for dignitaries or whoever. And there was Kim next to Yeltsin's mama. And the man who took us there was saying very proudly, Yeltsin's mama. And there was Kim's grave. And, I sort of laughed about it because it was slightly ridiculous, but there were freshly cut flowers that someone had just left there.
Wow.
Yeah. And that was quite something. Because I guess I can sort of, I've learnt or I'm trying to learn not to, maybe it's the other way around, to sort of see Kim as lots of different people. He's sort of, he's my grandfather, and I have those memories of him, and then he's the idealist, and then he's the traitor, and then he's and even within that, there's so many different versions of him. Within my family, he's a different person to everyone. It's just, so I'm able to sort of isolate my reactions to things in a way. But that was a very sort of moving experience.
Yeah, it must have been. It must have been incredible, because I think you called him Grandpa Kimsky. Is that correct?
Yeah. Grandpa Kimsky. I don't know where that came from. And then so I've got a couple of letters that he wrote to me personally, and they are gorgeous, and I know that I'm biased, but they are truly, truly gorgeous letters. And at the end, he signs his name, Grandpa Kimsky, but on the letters that he writes to my dad, he signs off Panina, which is sort of a conflation of Pa and Nina, which is short for Rufina.
Right.
And it's that sort of like playful coding, like he wasn't, no one was going to not realize that was him, but he sort of gave himself these little names. He was quite a playful character as much, as well as being many other things beside.
I really appreciate you sharing that, Charlotte. That's really
a pleasure.
Really interesting. That's an understatement, by the way. Growing up with the surname Philby, did that cause any problems for you?
It definitely caused problems for my parents, and there were moments, like I remember being in a shop in Arizona where some of my mum's family lived, and we were refused service on the basis of the name on our credit card. You're not welcome around here. And that's quite shocking. But,
wow.
But it's also not shocking when you understand the context. As a child, I didn't. Since then, I think my memories of understanding that something was different and that something was quite wrong are sort of mainly around the time that he died, and we were sort of hounded by paparazzi, and it was a very dark time, and people weren't really hiding it from me because I was only 5.5, so I couldn't understand it anyway. And obviously people were trying to shelter me, like in the way that you do a child from anything that's going to be negative for them. But somebody alerted me to a photo that was for sale on the internet, and it was a paparazzi shot of my dad with a suitcase getting into our Volvo on our street in Kentish Town. And me as a child with plaits staring back into the camera, just looking very scared and worried. And I had this like flashback really. I think it's best described as, to this feeling of like total unease and like being very scared and not understanding what's happening. And I spoke to my mum, and she said that he was on his way to Kim's funeral, and I didn't know where he was going. I didn't understand what was happening, but we were being chased by photographers, and there was like a real sense of intrusion, and our phones were being tapped, and it was not a good thing. But then, I also had memories of family holidays in Moscow as very sort of ordinary and just jolly and like really warm memories. So yeah, I don't know. I get that in a way, it's been very helpful to me. Like, I understand that as a journalist, people, when I first started, when I first joined The Independent in 2006, sort of newly qualified, having graduated from the NCTJ, my mum did say to me, be very careful because you can't trust journalists. They can't get anything from you. And obviously she was right. Journalists at The Independent tended to have more morals, but there was definitely an interest. But then also it sort of triggered, I think I reached a certain stage where people would see my surname and then they say, oh, Kim Philby, let me tell you about your grandfather. And I guess it sort of was beginning of a feeling maybe that I was sort of having my family history retold to me in a way that didn't sort of reflect the experience as I understood it. But that sort of led me on this journey of, I suppose, trying to understand how one story can mean so many different things to different people, and how, that's sort of endlessly fascinating to me. I guess with my first novels, because they're not traditional spy novels, and there's something very different. I think maybe some people felt a bit cross because there was obviously in the press, there was a connection made between me and my grandfather and my books being inspired by him. And then it was like, hold on, this is not what I signed up for. And I think some people felt an aversion to that, which I understand. But with this book, obviously it's, I'm not looking at it obliquely. I'm going full frontal into the question of who my grandfather really was. But I wanted to do it in a way that felt like I was bringing a new story and something that justified talking about him, because I didn't want to tell a story. I very actively, actually, I was approached about writing a book years and years ago, and I said, no, like, I don't have anything to add. And at that stage, I didn't feel I did. And it wasn't until I'd spent so long sort of reading his letters and thinking about him, and then finding the story about Edith, that sort of brought new light onto sort of, a story that's been told so many times. And that's not to say that Edith's story hasn't been told. There's her Peter S. Junk wrote a brilliant book, unfortunately only in German and French, or it's written in German and translated into French, about Edith. But for somebody like me who had read so much about the Cambridge spies and actually never seen her name as anything more than a footnote until I saw her referred to by Anthony Blunt as the grandmother of us all, it seemed like, okay, this is a story that deserves to be told.
Absolutely. And it is a rich story that you're telling here. Obviously there's, you've had to imagine the conversations and what went on. But I think you portray that period really well, and what must have been, it's trying to get into Edith's head and try and think what she was thinking at the time and what she was trying to achieve, because it's a sad story as well. I mean, it's immensely sad. How her life ends, and her son as well, and the struggle of being a single parent during that period, as well as dealing with a son who's not well, and trying to seek the right treatment for him, and whilst still being watched by MI5 and being under surveillance and being prevented from getting jobs as well. There was obstruction going on there to try and prevent her even earning a livelihood, which is why she ends up in Brighton running an antique shop. I mean, it's a sad story, but it's a story of a strong woman who wanted to live independently, think independently, and break out of the mold of a lot of women during that period. And whilst you might disagree with the politics that she becomes involved in, you can see why people get involved in that in the politics during this time. I think if you read the history of that time, you can see why people got involved in left-wing politics.
Absolutely. But I wanted to punctuate that with certain moments, like key moments, with the Nazi-Soviet pact, where there must have been, there was certain cognition there, something was afoot. And then with Stalin's purges. And I really wanted to try and understand how she could have reconciled that with the decisions that she had already taken. And I guess, I don't know the answer. And obviously I'm hoping that the book is a sort of a considered study of that. And I don't want to undermine it by saying something trite about that now. But I feel that she probably felt, and Kim to a degree, that it was partly that they truly believed in the cause that they had initially joined up to, but also a sense that how does one extricate themselves once they're that deep? For Kim, it would have been he would have faced execution. For Edith, she had a child. She couldn't risk, the many different fallouts. But I do genuinely believe with Edith that she just believed she could change the world, and she was going to give it her best bloody shot regardless. And, I always think there's a bit of a get out clause with Marxism because it's never the final epoch. So, you can always argue that, well, this is all sort of part of the journey towards that sort of golden conclusion. But Kim used to say to my mum, even, at the bitter end, history will judge me kindly. He really believed, or at least he definitely was convinced enough to say convincingly to my mum that he believed that they had done the right thing. And I think in many ways he probably did, but I do think there also must have been nights where he struggled to sleep.
If you devote so much of your life and make decisions that so determine your life, it's really difficult to extricate yourself from that belief system and say, actually, I was wrong there, or even I was slightly wrong. And particularly living in the Soviet Union, he wouldn't want to sort of rock the boat there because he was, he was being looked after. Have you ever watched that film of him speaking to the Stasi in East Berlin?
Yeah. I had a lovely, and I've been so fortunate because so many people from all sides have sort of come forward to me since, and been very generous with their information. And the creator of the CIA archives took me aside and showed me that. Just I think it was just before it became sort of put into the public domain, and I thought that was interesting, but I thought the far more interesting thing for me, and perhaps it's because his mannerisms are so similar to my dad's and my uncle's, but when I see that 1951 press conference and
in his mum's flat,
he's supposedly giving this really convincing story about I am not the third man. He's smirking. He's so very clearly sort of lying. And I just think, bloody hell, how did he get away with that? But yes, I have seen that. I have seen him.
I mean, I've heard that, and where did I? So you know how you read things or you hear things, you just can't remember where you heard it.
That's the story of my life.
But that 1951 press conference has been shown to like intelligence trainees to show a masterclass in lying. But I can't somehow believe that, because you're right. You can see almost the tongue in his cheek, actually.
What's going?
Yeah.
It's shocking. I would have thought it would be used as, evidence of how easily you can dupe the sort of the world if they want to believe something, I think.
Yeah. Maybe it's used in that context because the thing is it's very easy to look at it in hindsight and say, oh, I can see he's lying, because you know the end of the story. But
no, I don't think so. But I think it's because he's got really similar mannerisms to my dad, and it's like it's almost like a sniff thing he does, like that. It's just one of those things that you wouldn't know unless you'd seen it.
Unless you're a Philby, you wouldn't know, huh?
Yeah. But it was. I mean, it wasn't funny, but it was interesting when I wrote the piece for The Independent about this sort of epic trip that we did. My then boyfriend, now husband, Barney, did to Moscow. When I wrote it up, the guy who sat opposite me, the chief reporter at the Indie at the time, looked over his monitor and said, Buster the Crack Milno you referred to, who sort of failed to get the information out of him at that time. He was my grandfather. We each other. We worked on many stories together. So
wow,
yeah,
that's a brilliant coincidence. That.
Oh no, excellent man.
Brilliant. Of the the letters that you've got from Kim, what would you say is your favourite one, or what's your favourite line from one of those letters that you always remember?
I'll read it.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to find it. It's on my phone, so give me a second. But, like purely narcissistic is the one that he wrote to me. But actually, there are several that I think are hilarious. The one that I think is just magic because it's so ridiculous is he, before we used to go and visit him, he would send these epic shopping lists. And you would not believe the things that he requested. In fact, I'm just going to read you a couple of examples. Okay, so my very favourite, and it's because it's written to me, but this is the one that I said before was gorgeously written, and I think you'll probably agree. Says, "My darling Charlotte, thank you for the lovely postcard which you sent to me from Cambridge. I wonder whether you yourself will be living there round about the year 2000. Studying hard, or, more likely, raising hell. I say more likely raising hell, because with your daddy, your grandpa, and your great-grandpa, you have a tradition of misbehaviour to sustain. In return for your postcard, I am sending you one of a young Siberian tiger. He looks very sweet, but when he is full-grown, he will be one of the biggest tigers in the world, not the sort of thing you would like to meet in Gorky Park on a dark night. I'm afraid he will probably end up in a zoo, because they are getting fewer and fewer. Daddy will explain to you the destructiveness of man. I wonder whether you have found anywhere to play in the sun this summer. We've had a dismal time with the occasional sunshine, but mostly grey skies and quite a lot of rain. In the southern mountainous parts of the country, it's been rather dreadful, with torrential rain causing big floods, avalanches and mudslides, not mentioning frightful hailstorms. Well, as you might say, c'est la vie. Well, you little imp, please give our love to Mummy, Daddy, and keep lots for yourself. Don't postpone your next visit too long. Lots of cuddles and kisses from Babushka and Grandpa." And actually, interestingly, in that letter, he doesn't sign it Kimsky. There's so many things I love about that, but one of them is demonstrating his preoccupation with the weather. He's got this absolute obsession, which when you read the book will become apparent.
Yes, it does become apparent.
I have taken some of it out. I was sort of tempted to take more out, but I just think it's so telling. It's just so bloody English, isn't it? You move to the behind the Iron Curtain, and of all the things that you have to report, you mustn't fail to mention the weather.
I mean, that letter sort of reinforces what you were saying earlier about the different facets or the different faces of anyone, for example, really. There's the grandfather, there's the KGB agent, there's the loyal civil servant, there's the father, lover, there's all of those different faces there. And, even though, your grandfather is hated by some people because he was a traitor, you hear a human voice there rather than what's in a history book or something like that. And that's one of the things I love about doing this podcast, is getting the human side of the Cold War, not the guns and the tanks and all of that side, but the relationships that went on and would have happened regardless whether the Cold War was there or not, but just give you a little bit more insight into people's experience and what people were like. And very few people would think of Kim Philby as the doting grandfather of Charlotte.
Yeah, I know.
But that richly illustrates it.
Yeah. And I don't feel, I don't feel this like duty to show that, because I understand he's earned his reputation, and I don't feel like, I definitely don't think he would have felt he needed me to do so. But I think it's interesting. And as you say, I just think that sort of human history for me is just far more interesting. And the fact, not more interesting, but it sort of illustrates, it just illustrates so much, I think historians, you have to choose a version of truth to follow. You have to have the confidence of your conviction when you say, okay, well, I'm going to assume that X, Y, and Z is true. And it's almost like being a scientist. For me, and the reason I wanted to write this as a novel is because there are so many versions of history, and it's those stories, those individual moments that make up the sort of rich tapestry of life. And when people try to define these people and wholly understand them, I understand the need to want to do, or the need or the want to do that. But I don't think it's possible without. I don't think it's possible at all. I don't think it's possible with anyone. I use a quote which I'm going to completely bastardize now, but by A.A. Milne at the beginning of the book, which is everybody is a mystery to everybody else. Essentially, we can never truly know another person. And I think when it comes to these characters that we think we understand, or that we know, or that we are frustrated that we don't understand, we make such an effort to try to explain their actions because they seem so abhorrent or incomprehensible, and the impact, the ramifications are so huge that we need to sort of understand them. But people are complex and nuanced and flawed, and I know for myself, I'm one person one day and I'm another the next. Essentially, I'm the same person, obviously, but we're all made up of these different facets, and I'm a different person when I'm speaking to different people. When I'm with my children, I'm different to when I'm at work. And I just think it's really interesting when we sort of see other sides to people who, especially with a story like the Cambridge Spies, where we feel it's been so well told, and it has, but maybe there's something else that just throws a slightly different light on what we knew.
Yeah. Well, you've definitely shed a load of light on Edith Tudor-Hart. I found the story really, really gripping and really well put together, because I thought I knew the Cambridge Five story. And whilst this is, some of the dialogue is imagined, you're basing this on SIS files and known events that happened in Edith's life. And whilst it's not non-fiction, I think it's a welcome addition to the literature around the Cambridge Five, and Edith's pivotal involvement in it, which I don't think many people knew about.
Yeah.
You've mentioned these other books, but then there's not a lot in English, it sounds like.
There's not, or certainly not a lot that I've found, and believe me, I've looked.
Yeah.
Which sort of comes with quite a deal of responsibility, and I have to be clear that I have this is a character. I feel I know her so intimately, and I do genuinely believe that, but that I have to remember that this is a version of her life that I have reconstructed and reimagined. And some of the characters in the book don't exist beyond my imagination, and hopefully now or soon in the imagination of readers. But within the files, there's such a sense of her life and also the extraordinary nature of what she was doing, in that in a single paragraph, you'll have her going from her job as a photographer at Studio Sun to, sort of to meet with one of her sort of co-conspirators, a fellow spy, sort of discussing the creation of the first atomic bomb. And en route, she goes to pick up her son, Tommy, from Anna Freud, who's treating him for his conditions. And you see in the files them talking about her looking after this boy who looks very worried and has this sort of very withheld demeanor. He didn't speak. He was extremely, I don't want to say difficult because that puts an element of blame on him, but he was an ill child. But what's also interesting is that we have her letters to, for example, Alexander, and to Donald Winnicott, with whom she had a relationship. She sort of entrusted Tommy to his care, and to my mind, he completely betrayed her trust by having a relationship with her and then sort of not fulfilling. I don't want to give too much away, but it wasn't a good situation. But you can see in the letters that she's written to them, it's almost sort of neurotic need, which is so at odds with her braveness and her sort of independence and her sense of self. So within the files, there's not just that sort of voyeuristic, her being watched, but also files where we actually see her writing and how she spoke. And I also interviewed family members, which was so wonderful, and having their memories that I've sort of woven in to scenes was sort of invaluable.
Yeah, it's if you're weaving them in, it's definitely a rich tapestry that you've.
My metaphor has been.
Yeah, it hit home there. Is there anywhere where you can see Edith's photos? Is there a book of her photos or not?
There's a wonderful book of her photos, and it's called "In the Shadow of Tyranny" by Duncan Forbes, who is an art historian, and I'd highly recommend it. There's another book called In the Eye of Conscience by her brother, Walsh Shasitsky, which is smaller and lovely, but for the full sort of, the full range of her work, I would say go for In the Shadow of Tyranny by Duncan Forbes.
Right. I'll look out for that, because I think that this is the other side. I know we mentioned it right at the start, but she was an amazing photographer and was working for some high-profile publications as well when she was in London. Absolutely, and she really sort of resisted. She sort of managed to balance commercial work with, work that was about sort of capturing a time. She went and photographed the miners with her husband, Alexander Tudor-Hart, who then went off and he was a surgeon, helped the wounded in the Spanish Civil War for free before, and then they broke up soon after that. But she took the amazing photographs, sort of encapsulating the poverty in Vienna and in London. But she really resisted sentimentalizing, and she really didn't like that. It was politicized photography, but she didn't cheapen it. She didn't sort of try to. She just wanted to show things as they were, and her work is stunning. And I was really fortunate because there was a contemporary of hers who actually, they never met, Dorothy Bong, who is also a lauded photographer from Vienna from around that period. And she also worked with the Rolleiflex camera, which Edith used. And I suddenly realized there were a couple of scenes, where she's developing her photos. And I suddenly thought, I've got no idea how a Rolleiflex works, or, how. So I got in touch with a photographer friend of mine, and he said, I've got no idea either, but perhaps you could contact, there's a foundation, Insiders, Outsiders, which is really interesting. It sort of celebrates the contribution of refugees from Nazi Germany, I think Germany and Austria.
And this is Dorothy's daughter, Monica, who runs that. So she went and asked her mother, Dorothy, to sort of give me an insight into the mechanics of actually using a Rolleiflex camera and developing the film, and her little insights and actually the sort of the emotions that Dorothy attached to those explanations I've borrowed for the book as well. So it's fascinating. And I think being a photographer, for her was like a tool. As a spy, it's perfect, isn't it? You've got a pram, so you're invisible. Like no one sees a woman with a pram. And then you've got a camera, so you've got an excuse to be everywhere and sort of taking pictures of all these things. You really couldn't make it up, or at least I couldn't make it up. But maybe I'm just not a good enough of a storyteller. But
well, I doubt that very much, based on your track record and based on reading this. So now I've only got I've got the review copy, so I haven't got the name with Edith and Kim on. But that quote is from an interview with Kim, isn't it?
I believe so. I actually don't know where it came from in terms of objective history, but my dad used to use it, to sort of, if anyone asked him, I can't remember exactly how he phrased it when my husband asked him, but, did your dad, do you feel that he was a traitor? And my dad sort of borrowed his phrase and said, to betray, you must first belong, and Kim never felt he belonged. And I think that is true, whether or not it's a justification, I think it's true that he never felt that he belonged. And I feel what's fascinating about his story, and also sort of what I love about the Le Carré books, which I sort of think really encapsulates this kind of character, is those sort of insider outsiders, and people who are, maybe with Le Carré books, more sort of changing the system from within. But I think the juxtaposition for Kim between feeling part of the establishment and feeling removed from it was very apparent and sort of laced through his life and his tastes and the way that he lived. And those contradictions maybe made him less, in my mind, slightly of such an empathetic character, because I feel like Edith was true to herself and true to not just what she believed, but what she experienced, and sort of never wavered.
Yeah. I guess for her, she never had to really hide her beliefs, though.
That's also true. And I do make that point in the book through. At one point, I have Kim sort of reflecting on the fact that he's actually quite envious of her ability to just live her life as she was, without concealment. Obviously, it wasn't, she had to conceal her beliefs to a degree, but she could live truly as who she was. And he probably envied that in her, or I imagine in the book that he envied that in her. But obviously the flip side is that he gets to live this relatively lavish life and ends up with a state burial in a flat given to him by the KGB, in contact with his family, and at risk of ruining the ending. Edith's life does not turn out in sort of a similar way, or in a way that I feel like she deserved. And I suppose that this book at least helps her get the recognition that I think she deserves. Whether or not you, as you said earlier, you believe her politics, I think she deserves to be recognised for the effort that she made, with no rewards, never paid. She lived in poverty. She made all the commitments that the men who were sort of doing the same thing on the other side, the Cambridge spies, didn't have to.
So the book is called Edith and Kim. When's it published, Charlotte?
The 31st of March. But it's available for pre-order now.
You can pre-order it now. I've been very lucky to get an advance copy, so I've read it. So it gets the Cold War Conversation seal of approval. And we're also going to be doing a book giveaway. So if listeners want to be in the chance of winning a copy, you will have to go to the episode notes, and there'll be details of how to access those at the end of this. But Charlotte, I've really appreciated your time. It's been a lot of fun chatting with you. You know, hearing about the book, which is brilliant, but also just hearing some insights into your grandfather as well.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and it's so nice to finally do it. I feel like I've been looking forward to this for a while, so thank you.
Well, we've been trying, I think I first got in contact with you about 3 years ago, I think.
We've
been trying to line this up, but I think what we've been doing is waiting for the right book.
And hopefully
it's finally arrived. Have you ever thought about doing any non-fiction, or is fiction definitely your bag?
I have thought about it, and you know, I am a news journalist by sort of trade, but with this book, I didn't feel I could get. I just felt I had to disassociate to a degree doing it as fiction. But no, I'm sure that non-fiction will the right idea will come to me one day, and it'll happen. But for the moment, I'm just making it up as I go along.
So listeners of Cold War Conversations, rush out and buy Edith and Kim. Highly recommended. Thank you very much, Charlotte.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, don't forget details of our book giveaway, which will be in our episode notes alongside photos and videos that accompany it. Will show as a link in your podcast app. Now, this show wouldn't exist without our generous Patreons, so I want to thank one and all of them for their support. You can very easily become a Patreon by going to coldwarconversations.com/donate. And you can also join our Facebook group where listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Thanks very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye. Thanks for listening right through to the end. I really appreciate it. And maybe check out our store and see if you can find the ideal gift for the Cold War enthusiast in your life. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/store. Thanks for listening.